In this section, we will discuss how to plan scope management. This is the first process in the scope management section. And a lot of people confuse this one. When they read plan scope management, they think you're developing the scope here. But in reality, what you're doing in plan scope management is you're developing the approach that you want to use for scope management. So you could actually read that heading there. Instead of plan scope management, you could read it as plan scope management approach. The scope management approach, it's going to be covering how the project and product scope will be defined, validated, and controlled. So, as I mentioned, it will not include the scope itself, but it includes how scope is going to be managed throughout the project, and that includes many different things such as the WBS, the requirements, what templates, what documents, what software, and so on, and not necessarily identifying the actual scope of the project. You'll see here in the outputs that your key outputs here are the scope management plan and the requirements management plan, and that those don't include the actual scope or the requirements, and instead what they include would be the approach we want to use in managing those. You'll see here in the inputs, your key inputs here would be your quality management plan, because in the quality management plan, there are certain requirements or steps or policies that the organization may have, or methodologies or standards that will need to be implemented on the project. If that's the case, those need to be part of how you manage scope. This will be part of how you maybe define or specify requirements on your project, or maybe how you validate the requirements after they've been completed, after the work is done. Also, if you look at the project lifecycle description here, it talks about maybe phases that your project may go through, and if that's the case, a lot of what you do in scope verification or validation may be tied to the completing of those phases. And finally, the development approach that will be used on the project will have its own effect. So if you're using waterfall or iterative and so on, these would have an effect in the sense that the planning or the scope that you think about for waterfall is like the full project scope, whereas if you're doing iterative, these are like repetitive pieces of your project and could be, similar, but, but being repeated over and over. Adaptive or agile is going to allow you to work with a backlog, and from that backlog, you're prioritizing which of these features or requirements are going to go into the next project. So your definition into your next sprint, so the definition of the project scope is different depending on whether you're going with waterfall or you're going with agile, along with the other two factors that we mentioned previously. So these are things that we need to consider when we are coming up with the scope management approach. All right, the other thing that we need to look at is options. A lot of times you will find that there are approaches that are pretty simple based on Microsoft Word, based on Excel. So I could put my WBS, if you want, in Microsoft Word and use boxes and things like that to reference what the WBS looks like. Here on this screen, you'll see an example of a WBS that has been created in Microsoft Word, whereas I could use software like Microsoft Project or some other one to create my WBS. And here you'll see another one that I would have created with software. So you see there's more than one option that I could use to create my WBS. Likewise, the requirements document can also be created in Excel, but I could also use software to help me manage my requirements. So this is what we mean by evaluating alternatives. Each is going to come with its own scope of work, technical skills that are required, the software itself, the cost associated with it, and so on. The final outcome of evaluating your different options is that you'll develop an idea of how you want to manage your scope. So here you have the scope management plan as one of the outputs, and the other output that you're going to get is a requirements management plan. Let's look at the scope management plan and look at the components of it. The scope management plan itself is a part of the project management plan, and it describes how we want to manage scope. So it talks about how we want to define, how we want to develop, how we want to monitor, how we want to control and validate scope. And if you recall, what I was just showing you are how the WBS would have been developed. So we have more than one way that we can develop the WBS. There's more than one way to work with requirements. And so this scope management plan talks about how we're going to do every step of scope management. It does not have to be formal. It can be informal. It can just be agreed to verbally with your management or your sponsor. And it should include the following. How will you prepare your scope statement? You can use a Word template for that one. How you're going to create the WBS, and how you're going to set up your baseline, like who signs off on your scope baseline, who reviews it, you need to know that. And also, what do you do with changes afterwards? What if you need to make changes to the scope or the WBS and so on? How do you get formal acceptance of deliverables? So basically, how do you validate, how do you monitor, how do you control? These are components of your scope management plan. As mentioned, along with this, we have the requirements management plan. And with the requirements management plan, which is also part of your project management plan, we're going to describe how project and product requirements will be analyzed, how they'll be documented, which you can use Excel, how they're going to be managed. We can use traceability and change management and so on. We can also use baselining for requirements. So how these things are going to be done, who are the people that would maybe hold the original copy of the requirements document and so on. Who are the people that make decisions on changes? What is the process for making changes? So how are we going to do all requirements activities? How do we plan, track, report? Who will be involved? How will configuration management be done with regards to like changes? How do we analyze impacts? How are we going to trace? On what basis do we trace? We will cover traceability later on, but how do we trace or track our requirements? Traceability, by the way, is linking a requirement to a source, like who gave you that requirement, or what is the law or regulation that required that specific requirement. How will we be reporting on requirements? What are the different authorization levels that will be needed in order for us to approve a change once the requirements have been baselined? And speaking of that, how are you going to baseline the requirements? Who is the one that signs off on it? Is it your project sponsor? Is it a quality team who actually does that? What is our prioritization scheme or process? What carries the highest priority to us? Is it time? Is it cost? Is it features? What is it that's going to be our guideline? What about metrics? Do we have any metrics that we want to associate with requirements? Maybe number of changes, maybe how many times we go back to the same user or same client or stakeholder to collect that requirement. And maybe how many requirements we have, or how many we complete of these requirements. If you're working in an agile environment, how many will be completed by a specific time frame? When you work in agile, you work in a very fixed time, sometimes 10 days for every sprint, and you need to complete 10% of these features within that 10-day sprint. On a single day basis, you got to complete 10%. And what is our traceability approach that we want to use? So these are the things that we look at in order to come up with the scope management approach. At the end, you're going to have your requirements management plan, you're going to have your scope management plan, and it's going to be probably the best approach considering all the alternatives that you've looked at. All right, this takes us to the end of this one section, and on the next video, we will talk about how to collect requirements. Thank you for watching and for staying with us. Hope to see you on the next video. If you know others who would like to see these videos, feel free to share with them. Let us know what you think. Let us know if there's other topics that you're interested in. Would like to hear from you. Have a great day and see you on the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.